All right. Hi, a very good morning. Let me just confirm if we're live or not. Just give me a moment, guys. Yeah, this is roller coaster of good morning, Shruti. This roller coaster of a weekend. I'm sorry I wasn't able to conduct sessions over the weekend. Um, but yeah, we're gonna wrap up reasoning today, and then, as suggested by you all, we'll begin with FIJ from tomorrow morning. Just give me a moment. I'm doing well, Shruti. How about you? So yes, as always, before we begin with the session, allow me to quickly introduce myself. I'm Prankur Arora. I'm going to be your mentor on this marathon class. Today we're going to be studying critical reasoning. This is pretty much about me. I'm a trainer, a coach. I've been in the learning industry for quite some time now. I'm a published author as well, and I hold advanced certifications in facilitation from Leadership Management International, which is the world's largest organization working in the domains of leadership. And I run this startup by the name of Thought Sutra, wherein uh, we are trying to evangelize and promote the learning of the creative arts in our country. Uh, on the platform, this class is being conducted on YouTube, but we have a platform which offers free as well as subscription based models for different kinds of classes. There's real time enablement for interaction between the learners as well as the educator on the platform, engaging in discussions, doubt clearing, even the question answers. They're conducted in a very novel format, which is of the live polls. Hi, Kritika. Welcome to the class. We regularly conduct tests and quizzes on the platform as well. All the courses on the platform are structured, and with one subscription, you get unlimited access to it all. These are the various models. You can clearly see as the time period goes up, the cost of the subscription per month comes down. And if you use my name Prankur, you will get an extra 10% off on any of the subscriptions that you go for. Let's start with the first question for the day. Right. So this is again an argument construction question. If the statements above are true, which of the following must also be true? Now understand that they're asking you to draw an inference here, right? If they're asking you to draw an inference, they're asking you to. All right, Asim, a very good morning to you as well. Shruti says C. All right. Okay. Now, what is the situation in the argument? Let's understand the situation, right? Thank you for your answer, Shruti. Let's understand the situation. It says percentage of households with an annual income of more than 40K is higher in Merton than in any other county. However, the percentage of households with an annual income of 60K or more is higher in Soma County. Okay. Now the situation is that we are talking about two counties. One is Merton M and the other is Sommer S. They say that percentage of households with income of more than 40K. X is more than 40K. It is higher in Merton, right? and the percentage of households with annual income of 60 or higher is the case with Sommer County. So here X is more than 60K for Sommer County, right? So this is the situation. On the basis of this particular information, which point must be true, right? Now, understand that the given information makes clear that this county, Merton, it has some households that exceed 40K in income, $40,000 in annual income, and Sommer has a percentage of households with annual income at or above $60,000, right? A higher percentage of the Merton County households must in turn have annual incomes of 60 or less, right? Because we're talking about how here annual income is more than 40, right? Now, this has the greatest percentage of people with annual income more than 40. So, perhaps, perhaps since it is greatest percentage, most of those people might lie between 40 and 60, right? That range, because 60K upper, the best percentage is for Sommer County, right? So 40 to 60 will likely be that range will likely be apparent when it comes to Motown County, right? That is a direct inference that we can draw from this particular information. Thus, annual income of some households in Motown County is between $40,000 and $60,000, and there Shruti has gotten the perfect answer. Well done, Shruti. Let's move on to the next question. Now, this one is an evaluation question. You have to weaken the argument. This is what we call argument evaluation. C or D? Alright. Okay. Do we have answers by anybody else? Okay. Muskan says C as well. Alright. So, what is the situation here? What is the situation? The situation is that we are talking about an advertising campaign, right? We're talking about an advertising campaign which was responsible for increased sales of canned tuna. The product here is canned tuna, right? Tuna is a fish. Now, since the profits from the increased sales were less than the cost of the campaign did not contribute to the company's economic interests. This is what they are telling us, that profits were lesser than the cost of the campaign. So the campaign, it did not contribute to the economic interest, to further diet's economic interest. It did nothing to further those interests. So we have to weaken the argument. Now, consider the basis of the argument, right? What is the basis? If we are talking about profits, and if those profits are lower than the cost, the campaign, it made no contribution to the financial well-being of this company called Diets Foods, right? That is what they're saying. Now, in what case might this be untrue? Right, in what case might this be untrue? That is what we have to prove, right? That this is untrue. That is how we will weaken the argument. Now, what if the advertising campaign, it reversed an industry wide trend of declining sales? What if that happened? What if throughout the industry, not just Diets Foods, the sales were going down, but the campaign, it reversed the trend, right? If Diets experienced increasing sales while other companies experienced decreasing sales, then the campaign did contribute to the economic interest of the company, right? Right? If the sales for Diets went up, right, and the sales for other companies went down, even if profit has not surpassed the cost, but the trend has reversed. Earlier, other companies, their sales were going up and Diets ki sales were going down, but Diets ki sales now are going up and the other sales are going down. Sales for other organizations are going down. If that is the case, then obviously the economic interest of the company, the it has improved and argument is considerably weakened, don't you think? So when you look at option E, which says in each of the past 5 years there was a steep industry-wide decline in sales of canned tuna, right? And that has basically reversed because of Diets Foods, because they are saying last year it sold 12 million cans compared to 10 million sold during the previous year. So 2 million increased, right? Which was not happening earlier, right? So this means that the trend is on an upward swing and Diet's financial health will continue improving because the sales are going up. The trend is reversing, right? Shruti, when you look at C says a less expensive advertising campaign would have brought in significantly fewer new customers for Diet's canned tuna than did the campaign Diet's Food launched last year. Now, this information, it neither strengthens nor weakens the argument, right? They are just putting across a hypothetical scenario that this would have happened, right? And this was better than what happened last year. But it does not really tell me anything, right? It is not really evaluating the current advertising campaign that we are talking about. So neither does it strengthen nor does it weaken the argument. Are you getting my point? And when you look at option D, Shruti, D says Diets made money on sales of canned tuna last year. See, the argument is not about profits only, but about whether the advertising campaign contributed to the financial well being of the organization or not. The argument is about whether the campaign did anything to further Diet's economic interests. Right? So, therefore, in that context, I'll eliminate option D as well. Okay, let's move on to the next question now. This is again an argument construction question. You're constructing the argument. Why? Because the question says which of the following, if true, does most to justify the expectations of the analyst. Right? So you're still constructing the argument here. You're not evaluating it. D or A? Okay. Most probably D. Alright. Let's understand the argument then. Let's look at what the argument is. What is it asking from us? What is the situation there? We are talking about vineyards and the grape growing season. Right now, they are saying that we have one scenario which is in the case of hot and dry weather, and they are saying such kind of weather, hot and dry weather, at the end of a grape growing season, it reduces the yield. It does what? It reduces your yield, right? And then they say that because it reduces yield, winemakers, they're able to manufacture, they're able to produce only a small quantity of wine. At the same time, they say analysts, they expect that this weather will increase the winemakers' revenues, right? So how is that possible when it is just reducing the yield, when it is producing very small quantity of wine? How does it increase revenue? That is what we are trying to get at. Now, what additional piece of information do we need to explain the analyst's expectation, right? So you're still constructing the argument, you have to justify the reasoning. Now, the same condition that leads to low quantity, right? The same condition that leads to very low quantity, uh, it will also lead to something that increases revenue. That is the only way that you can justify the fact that the revenues will increase, right? So the condition that is leading to low yield, the condition that is leading to low production, at the same time it has to lead to an increased revenue as well. How could this be, right? That is what we have to figure out. Now, if these weather conditions that we are talking about, the hot and dry weather, if it leads to, say, a higher quality grapefruit, if it leads to high quality wine that will eventually sell for high prices, then the expectation might come true, right? What if, hi Dhanush, I'm doing well, how are you? So, what if right now you are pocketing how much? You're pocketing, say, $500, right? Right now you're pocketing $500. What if, because of this hot, dry weather, you're producing less wine, but that wine is leading to a premium, that grapefruit is leading to a premium flavor in the wine, and now you're selling every bottle at, say, $1,500, right? So, your profits are going up, even if the number of bottles that you're selling goes down, but you're still making more revenue, right? That is what we are trying to get at. ठीक है? Imagine you were selling $500 की 5 bottles, and now you're selling 3 bottles for $1,500 each, right? So what is better? This situation is better, right? ठीक है? So that is the logic that you had to apply in this one, and keeping that in mind, Shruti, the answer would be E. Grapes that have matured in hot, dry weather, they make significantly better wine than ordinary grapes. If the wine is better, then you can sell it at better prices, therefore, you can have high revenues. But if you look at option D, D says when hot, dry spells are followed by heavy rains, the rains frequently destroy grape crops. Right? So the statement gives another example of weather's effect on grape, but it does not really explain how revenues are increased. The argument is about revenues. We have to explain how, when you have low yield, you are still able to make better revenue. That is what you had to explain. D does not talk about revenue at all. Okay, when you look at A, the lower a vineyard's yield, the less labor is required. See, less labor means less expenditure, but does not really explain an increase in revenue again. प्रोडक्शन कम होगी, वाइन कम बनेगी, तो रेवेन्यू कैसे बढ़ेगा श्रुति? आपको एक्सप्लेन करना है रेवेन्यू बढ़ेगा. Even A is telling me that the cost is going down, but it is not really telling me how revenues would increase. The question is about revenues, right? Result in increased revenues. A tells me about reduction in cost, but tells me nothing about revenues. ठीक है? Let's look at the next question. All right. Yes, most seriously undermines means you have to weaken the argument. You have to weaken the argument and essentially evaluate it. Ayushi says C. All right. So let's look at the situation in the argument. Yes. What is the situation? We are talking about how 10 years ago. We're talking about how 10 years ago there were wooden sleds which began to be replaced by plastic sleds. Right. That is one of a part of the premise. Shruti says B or C as well. All right. So we are talking about how wooden sleds 10 years ago they began to be replaced by plastic sleds, and that plastic sleds go faster but they are harder, slightly harder to control. And then the premise is that plastic sleds are more dangerous. They're what? They're more dangerous than wooden sleds because more children suffered injuries last year than they did 10 years ago. That is what the argument is. You have to weaken it. Now, the argument depends on a comparison of two kinds of sleds. We have a plastic versus a wooden, right? So, the basis of the argument is comparison of these two types of sleds, these two kinds of sleds. Now, any evidence that would either strengthen or weaken the argument must indicate a comparison as well, right? Now, evidence that applies only to one kind of sled or to both kinds of sleds equally cannot weaken this argument. Now, consider the idea that if plastic sleds can be used in a wider variety of conditions than wooden sleds can, then plastic sleds can be used more frequently, right? Now, it is possible that more frequent use rather than the sleds themselves have led to more accidents. For example, what I'm trying to get at is, right, which even Shruti and Ayushi pointed out correctly, is that, for example, wooden sled can only be used in two conditions. So, in 1 week, you are utilizing it, say, 2 times. But plastic sleds can be used in 5 different kinds of conditions. So, in a week, you are taking out the plastic sled 5 times, right? So the degree of injury or the degree of accident goes up with the number of usage as well, with the frequency of usage as well, right? अगर आप 2 बार sled को use कर रहे हो, so the most number of times that you will get injured is perhaps 2. But if you're using this sled 5 times, the most number of times that you are likely to get injured, right? Not likely, but the most number of times that you can get injured is 5, right? So only because your frequency of usage is going up, you the likelihood of your being involved in an accident or injuring yourself increases, the probability increases, right? So that is why the answer is C, and I agree there. Well done. Let's look at the next question now. Dhanush says E. All right. Again, your evaluation, your the question is about evaluation of a plan, right? You're evaluating a plan here. Ayushi says A. Okay. So, what is the situation? The situation is that in the face of decreasing or declining advertising sales, right? In the face of declining advertising scales, a newspaper it reorganizes its sales force, right? It reorganizes its sales force. Before reorganization, it was organized geographically. Uh, right now, this reorganization it attempted to increase the sales representative knowledge of client's business by having each sales representative deal with only one type of industry or of retailing, right? So the reorganization is basically so that sales representatives they have a better uh, okay, sales representatives they have a better understanding of business, right? Earlier it was geographically, now it is business wise, industry wise, right? तो retail में एक ही जाएगा, FMCG में एक ही जाएगा, आपका manufacturing में एक ही जाएगा. That is what they're trying to get at. Now revenue increased after reorganization. Revenue increased after reorganization, and what you have to do is you have to basically help determine the source of the revenue, whether the reason behind increase in revenue is only reorganization or it is something else, right? That is what we are trying to get at. What is it that we have to assess in order to properly conclude what is the reason behind the increase in revenue, right? That is basically something that we have to evaluate. Now, in order to attribute the increased revenue uh, to the reorganization of the sales force, other possible causes must also be eliminated, right? There could be other reasons that we have to eliminate, right? uh, Newspaper advertising rates they are often linked to circulation as well. For example, अगर मैं अपनी सोसाइटी में एक न्यूज़पेपर लॉन्च करूं, right? My society has what? My society has 500 residents, right? And I there out of 500 residents there are perhaps 10 entrepreneurs, and I go to those 10 entrepreneurs and I tell them, you know what, pay me 5 rupees a day for me to feature an article about your business in the newspaper that I'm circulating to this 500 people. Those guys will tell me nahi yaar, 500 is too less a circulation. Tomorrow I go to them and I tell them, yaar maine side wali society ko bhi incorporate kar liya hai. Now my newspaper circulation is happening to 1000 people, and now I'm not going to charge 5 rupees. What I'm going to charge is 10 rupees. And now these guys are happy to pay because the circulation has increased. So what I'm trying to get at is that the more circulation you have for your newspaper, the more traction that you have for your newspaper, the better rates you can charge for your advertising, because as circulation increases, higher rates can be charged, right? uh, so there's that. Now an alternate explanation can also be therefore that a significant rise in circulation happened, so therefore it was also that your revenue of advertising went up. Not that because you had, not because you only had better understanding of the businesses that you were catering to, but because our circulation went up, so the advertising rates went up and so the revenue went up. And that is being provided to me in option B, that has the circulation of the Greenville Times increased substantially in the last 2 years. If the circulation increased, the rates went up, and if the rates go up, your revenue goes up. As simple as that. Okay. And when you look at all the other options that you guys gave, let me just validate all the other options as well there. Uh, Perhaps option A was pointed out, which was what proportion of the revenue is generated by advertising sales. See, the question is only about advertising revenue, right? The question is about revenue from advertising sales. So the proportion of advertising revenue is to the total revenue is outside the scope of the question. Therefore, I'll eliminate option A there, and I'll eliminate option C, Because see, knowing how the advertising sales break down by type of business, it might be helpful to evaluate the sales targets that you give to your customer, to your sales agents, but really does not show the cause of the increase, right? That is why C will not be basically responsible for an increase in the revenue, or to evaluate the increase in the revenue. It might be helpful to evaluate the targets that you give to your employees or to your sales agents. Let's look at the next question then. The variance test. Can you shed a little light on what kind of variance test are we talking about? That is basically a part of I remember you're preparing for GMAT, right? So variance test might be something that helps you in statistical questions, right? वो आपके इंटीग्रेटेड रीजनिंग का पार्ट है क्या? आईआर का पार्ट है वेरिएंस टेस्ट, या डीआई का पार्ट है? Dhanush says A, all right. Okay, Asim, then develop a little context for me. I am slightly lost when it comes to the variance test. Give me an example or some context so that I can figure it out. Ayushi says C. Okay. So, alright, now that we have two answers, let's try and understand the situation in the question. Situation is that we are talking about motorists who complain about, traffic congestion. A or E. Okay, Shruti. Alright. So, we are talking about, because our technology has been improved, that's why I told A, sir. ठीक है, मैं सिचुएशन की बात कर रहा हूँ. Let's look at what the premise is. Right now I'm not zeroing in on the answer. Right now I'm evaluating the argument. What is it that they are talking about? They are saying that motorists, they complain about traffic congestion, right? They complain about traffic congestion in their country, and that it right. So we are talking about how motorists, they complain about the traffic congestion in their country, and that it is much worse than it was 20 years ago. The comparison is with something that occurred 20, or something that was the norm 20 years ago. But these conditions, they say, they have no basis, since the highway capacity in the country has tripled in the same period, right? Whereas the number of cars that are registered, it has only risen by 75%. So if earlier the highway was able to accommodate say 40 vehicles at any moment, now it is able to accommodate 120 vehicles. If earlier out of 40 there were 30 vehicles, now they are saying it has only increased by 75%. So 30 plus 75 by 100 into 30, that is what they're trying to get at, right? 3 fives are 1 5, 2 2, 22.5, 30 plus 22.5, so 120 capacity hui hai, so I am running 52 vehicles right now. That is what they're telling us through the premise, right? That is what the premise is. Now you have to undermine the argument, you have to weaken the argument. Now consider that, the response to the generalized complaint about congestion, it only the response to the generalized complaint, it only discusses the topic of the highway capacity. What if the congestion that motorists are complaining about is not on highways but on local roads, right? Discovering the travel trends to be local in the country and that the local roads have not really improved in the last 20 years would seriously weaken the argument. So, there I agree with Dhanush that if most automobile travel is local and the networks of roads and streets in the country's areas have changed little over the last 20 years, then it really weakens the argument. uh, so A is my answer in that regard. Asim, you said C, so let's look at C. That the country's urban centers have well developed public transit systems that carry most of the people who commute into those centers. See, the number of commuters who use public transit, it does not really affect the argument that the motorists' complaints have no basis, right? What if, uh, the number of people using public transit are also using their motorbikes? What if they're going to the metro station using the motorbikes, right? So the number of commuters using public transit is not really weakening or strengthening my argument when it comes to the motorist complaint, right? So therefore answer A is the most suitable in that regard. Okay, Asim, the what you're talking about is basically in assumption questions, right? What happens is when you have questions that are asking you about the assumption, that what is the assumption in the argument. No, it does not mean that we have to support the highway construction system at all. I'll take you back to this. Does not really mean that we have to support the highway construction system. What we are saying is that right now they're evaluating the complaint, right? They are evaluating the complaint. They are saying that motorists complain that the congestion has worsened, but then they are saying that the complaint, it has no basis because the highway capacity has tripled, whereas the number of cars registered has only increased 75%, right? So you have to weaken the argument saying that, you know what, the complaint is still valid because the complaint applies to local roads more than the highways right now. What if the motorists are complaining about local travel more than intercity interstate travel for which you use national highways? You don't really have to support the highway construction system, you have to plug a hole into the reasoning that they gave you. Okay. And the variance that you're talking about, Asim, it happens in assumption questions wherein they're asking you about assumption. Assumption question में क्या होता है? When you have five options, three, four, five. When you have five options, try and negate every option. When you negate every option, the by the negation of one of the five options, your argument will fall apart, right? Because then if you're negating the assumption, then your conclusion falls apart, ideally, right? If that assumption is basically the basis for the argument. So that is where variance wala test, which is about getting a yes or no answer, helps. But I've only ever read about it when it comes to assumption based questions, not when it comes to evaluation questions. वहां पे मैंने कोई वेरिएंस टेस्ट के बारे में नहीं सुना है, बट assumption क्वेश्चन में मैंने सुना है. Dhanush says A again. All right. Yeah, I agree. Necessary assumption as well as the inference questions, they are tested in almost all management exams. Assumption as well as inference. These two are tested almost everywhere. Okay, tell me on Telegram. Let me know what you're talking about because यहाँ पे I'm not able to understand the variance test that you're talking about. Shruti says A. All right. Dhanush said A as okay. Let's look at the let's look at what the situation is. The situation is that we are talking about a comparison of online classroom versus offline classroom, right? And we are saying that uh, a comparison between the two showed similar average grades, right? Just give me a moment. Okay. Uh, Sorry guys, I think there was a lag. Uh, okay, so they are saying a comparison of online and offline classroom showed similar grades, and that in determining these average grades, a course withdrawal was viewed as a course failure, and that the rate of withdrawal was higher from online than from classroom courses. Now you have to basically figure out a conclusion. If all the statements above are true, which of the following must also be true, right? So you have to figure out an inference, a conclusion that can be derived from this comparison, right? And now consider the ramification of the methodology that is used to kind of calculate the grade average for the two types of courses, right? Because of course withdrawals, the online courses experienced a higher rate of failure, but the average grade for these courses still match the average grade for physical classes, right? So from this, it is a logical step to conclude that for the two averages to match, the students who remained in the online courses, they must have had higher initial average, right? They must have had higher initial average than those in the classroom courses. So there I agree with Dhanush and I agree with Shruti that A makes sense, that among students who did not withdraw, students enrolled in online courses got higher grades on average than students who enrolled in classroom based courses. Well done. Get the next question. Eliminate B. Okay. The number of students enrolled per course. It says the number of students enrolled per course at the start of the school term is much higher on average for the online than for the classroom. See, a number of students cannot be derived from the discussion of average grades. We are talking about average grades, so number there does not make sense, right? We cannot compare number to average. ठीक है. C, A, and C. Okay. So again, this is an argument evaluation question where you have to strengthen, you have to support the argument. They're talking about how tour buses, they have damaged Renaissance buildings with their exhaust fumes because a lack of parking, it has kept it has basically kept the buses sitting idly at various curbs, and because the buses are idle, they're still the ignition is on, and the fumes, the carbon from the fumes, it basically ruins the buildings. Now, providing new parking for one third of the buses should significantly reduce the damage that is caused by the exhaust. That is what they're trying to get at, right? And you have to strengthen this. And there I agree to the idea that if tour buses typically they spend one quarter of the time they are in paletito transporting passengers from one side to another, right? Now the argument, see why, because why do I agree here? Because the argument for reduced damage, right, we are talking about reducing the damage, so the argument for that, it relies on the reduction of the exhaust fumes from vehicles. Now any additional evidence regarding the extent to which the vehicular emissions are likely to be reduced also supports the argument for the benefits of the new parking spaces. Exactly, Asim. So learning that, tour buses spend not just a few minutes but most of their time idling at the curb strengthens the argument, right? So the new parking spaces will allow one third of the tour buses to spend 75% of their time with engines off, right? Because we are talking about how only one quarter, they spend less than one quarter of their time. So 75% of the time will be spent in parking, and 75% of the time ke liye your ignition will be off, right? So therefore your fumes will go down and the damage will reduce significantly. That is why C is the answer here. Well done, Shruti. Well done, Asim. Dhanush, hope you've understood this. You went with A, right? The exhaust is not a significant threat. See, if exhaust is not a threat, then the argument is not affected at all. The argument is flawed. वो गड़बड़ हो जाएगी उसमें. You are going against the premise of the argument. That is not how we tackle arguments. ठीक है? Again, you have to strongly support the hypothesis. So here we have an argument evaluation question yet again. A or D, okay. D most probably. All right. Okay, so what is the situation here? Codex Berenices, a Florentine copy of an ancient Roman medical treatise, is undated but contains clues to when it was produced. Right. So the situation here is Dhanush also says A or D. All right. So the situation is it provides clues to when it was produced. The first 80 pages are by a single copies. Remaining 20 pages are by three different people. Right. The fact that the last 20 pages of the work of a succession of three different copies is an indication of serious turmoil at the time of copying, at the time of the copying, at the time of the copywriting was done, right? So they are talking about how the last 20, and Asim says, see, all right. Now, since a letter in handwriting identified as that of the fourth copyist mentions a plague that killed many people in Florence in 1148, Codex was probably produced in that year. And you have to support the argument. Right? So, what out of the five options that we have to figure out information that supports the hypothesis that dates the Codex to 1148. Right? Now, consider the basis of the hypothesis. Right? They are saying that the succession of copies indicating the work or the succession of the copies, it indicates that the work was significantly disrupted, and that the fourth copy's letter is indicating the plague of 1148 which caused serious loss of life. So from that it is argued, right, from this very point it is kind of argued that the plague of 1148 was the reason for the multiple copies, and that the work can thus be dated to that year. Right? What if there were multiple plagues? What if there were multiple plagues? Right? In that case, codex could have been produced on another time, right? It would have been produced at another time. It could have been produced at another time. If instead only one plague occurred in the 1100s, the elimination of that possibility supports supports the hypothesis that it was done in 1148. So D is my answer as well in that regard, that there was only one outbreak of plague in Florence in the 1100s. So or in disruption nahi ho sakta. Since there is only one occurrence, the disruption happened because of that single occurrence, and that is why uh, the statement D correctly identifies the circumstance that supports my hypothesis in the argument. Okay. Asim, you said C, a scribe would be able to copy a page of text the size and style of codex in a day. See, the amount of work a copyist could achieve each day does not really provide me with any information about the year that the work appeared in. Right? It does not really tell me about the year at all. It only tells me about the kind of work that can be achieved in a single day. Whereas when you look at D is eliminating the possibility of other outbreaks, of other plagues, of other situations that could have disrupted the copying process. It eliminates all the other options for me. Right? That is why I go with D. Let's look at the next question now. But plague may kill all copies. Why? Why can't people survive a plague? Extinction थोड़ी हो रहा है human species का. So that is why three died, no? And the fourth person wrote it down. So every copy started the work but died. C tells me about the amount of work one copyist could achieve in a single day. It does not really tell me about the year that the work appeared in. It does not tell me whether it was 1148, whether it was 1110 when all those works happened. Right? हम तो date कर रहे हैं. We are trying to date the piece. It is not really telling me anything about the year that the copying was done, if even if it was done by one person, one page a day. It was not telling me anything about the year, right? Plague killed many people, and that is why my copies were dying one after another. That is why I had three different copies, right? And D tells me that there was only one plague, so it could have happened only then. E, all right, Shruti, I'll consider E as your submission. Okay, so what is the situation in the argument, right? This is a very interesting argument. This is something you should discuss with your parents also. Right? So it says that we should not conclude that getting married causes one to live longer based merely on the fact that those who marry young they tend to live longer than those who never marry at all. That is what the premise of the argument is, right? And it says that those who marry young, they tend to have fewer unhealthy habits to begin with, such as drinking and smoking, than do those who will never marry. Okay, so those who marry young, they are saying they already have healthier habits. Now, which of the options strengthens the argument? The argument is basically what is it trying to do? सबसे पहले we should figure out what is the argument trying to do. The argument is trying to tell me, it is trying to show that the difference in longevity between the two groups need not be caused by marital status, right? That if you're young or if you're hitched, if you're married to somebody, it should not really be caused by marital status, is what the argument is trying to get at. The argument relies on the fact that even before marriage, those who will be married they tend to live healthier lifestyles than those who will never marry. अगर हमारा कोई friend है who decides that they will not get married, he might tend to have, that is what the argument is saying. It is not true for a fact, but the argument is saying that they might tend to have, slightly unhealthy habits such as smoking or drinking, right? Yet even if those who are apt to live longer are more apt to marry young, it could still be that marriage enhances for one's longevity. So by showing that a person who gets married young tends to live about as long as somebody who had been living an equally healthy life as a young adult but who never got married, the argument is strengthened there. And that is why I agree with Shruti. E is the answer, that among people who as young adults neither drink alcohol nor immoderately or nor smoke, those who never marry live as long as those who marry. So we are showing that, you know what, marriage is not a cause at all, right? So even people who don't drink, don't smoke, and never get married, they live as long as people who actually marry and live a healthy lifestyle as well, lead a healthy lifestyle as well. So it is basically removing the cause effect relationship between marriage and longevity. Asim, you went with C, that a person who smokes is much more likely than a non-smoker to marry a person who smokes at the time of marriage, and the same is true for people who drink alcohol immoderately. Okay. So Asim, C में क्या है ना कि even if a person with unhealthy habits who marries is more likely to wind up with a spouse with unhealthy habits than is a person with healthy habits who marries, that tells us it tells us nothing about whether the average person who gets married gets a boost in longevity or not. Right? It is not really telling me whether this pattern that you've observed it leads to longevity or not. So that is where I'll eliminate C. Shruti B tells me that a married person who has an unhealthy habit is more likely to give up that habit than a person with the same habit who is unmarried. See, again, this option two, it instead of strengthening the argument, it weakens the argument, right? It weakens the argument instead of strengthening it, since it suggests that marriage does indeed enhance longevity of a person. Right, this tells me that marriage will enhance longevity, but we had to prove that marriage has no relation with longevity, which E is giving me. B tells me that marriage will increase longevity because you're getting rid of your unhealthy habits. That is where I'll eliminate B. ठीक है. Next question. Shruti C. All right. Let's go through the situation of the argument. Right. Uh, so we know for a fact we have to weaken the argument. Right. What is the situation? The situation is we're talking about how last year the firms that are using PRP model, profit related pay model, PRP contracts, they found that productivity per worker increased as compared to firms that use traditional contracts which did not really have PRP clause. Right? That is basically the situation, mota mota. Now you have to weaken the argument, right? Uh, Weakening the argument means you have to say that PRP does not really increase productivity, right? Because you're saying PRP जिनके पास था उनकी productivity better थी, तो what you're trying to get at is that because of PRP those organizations, they were slightly more productive in terms of the work that they were able to accomplish, right? Now the argument uh, so any information out of the five options that will basically tell me that other factors contributed to increase in productivity instead of PRP, then I would go with them, right? So for example, if production equipment was modernized during the same period that the contracts took effect, it is possible that the modernized equipment was responsible for a higher level of productivity, and therefore I agree with Asim there that D is the answer. That many firms in the metalworking industry, they modernized equipment in the last 5 years, and most of these PRP were also introduced at the same time. So equipment could have contributed to productivity. So D is the correct answer in that regard. I'll eliminate C for you, Shruti. C says because introducing contracts, PRP contracts, greatly changes individual workers' relationship to the firm, negotiating the introduction of PRP is complex and time consuming. See, the difficulty of negotiating the contracts, it is kind of irrelevant to a conclusion about what happens once the contracts are in place, right? So the argument is talking about when the contracts are in place. कितना टाइम लगा कॉन्ट्रैक्ट को बना के इम्प्लीमेंट करने में, दैट इज नॉट अप फॉर डिस्कशन. We are talking about what happened after the contracts came into effect. All right, Shruti. So that is where I'll eliminate C. Next question. That is the trend that I've been seeing. When Shruti gets it right, you get it wrong. When you get it right, Shruti gets it wrong. So again, you have to weaken the argument, right? This is again an argument evaluation question. You're weakening it. B. All right, Shruti. Asim says B or C as well. All right, here the both of you have gotten it wrong. Why? Because okay, let's look at what the situation is, right? The situation is we're talking about how the original carpentry in hotels that were built before 1930, they it shows superior skill, it shows superior care, it shows superior effort to uh, that to superior effort than in the hotels that are built after 1930. So this is the cutoff here. Before 1930, great work, great skill, great effort. After 1930, not so much, right? Now this has led to a conclusion that carpenters working on hotels before 1930, they were superior in skill, care and effort than those who came after 1930, right? So the work that is done before 1930, it shows better it shows better care and skill and effort, right? So they are concluding from that, they are concluding about the skill of the people before 1930 and after 1930, and you have to weaken the argument, right? Now, uh, the what is happening in the argument, it draws an inference from a comparison between carpentry in hotels of different eras to a judgment about carpenters who were working in those eras. So if we are talking about say 1915, we are drawing a comparison between a hotel that was built in 1915 and a hotel that was built in independence at 1947. We are saying 1915 mein people, they had better skill only because we like the work a little more, and we think that the work carries a superior quality, the work carries better quality, right? So from this we are drawing a judgment about the skill of the people of the two eras, right? Now, one way to weaken this inference is by finding some way in which the carpentry may have been unrepresentative of the skill of the people, or the skill of the carpenters, right? Because the comparison is between the carpentry that is evident in the hotels, right? It is evident in the hotels of the two eras that still exist, right? We are talking about hotels that still exist to the day, right? Now, so therefore, if there is some reason to think that the hotels with good carpentry survive longer than those with bad carpentry, then still existing hotels from the older eras, they will have disproportionately more good carpentry, right? For example, if there are 10 hotels that are built in 1915 and there are 5 hotels that are built in 1947, अब इन 5 होटल का हमें काम इतना पसंद नहीं आया, but out of 10, 8 hotels ka pasand aaya, so those 8 hotels still continue to exist, and out of 5, say 3 hotels still continue to exist, right? Now if you look at this number, if you compare this number, you'll find that even when you assume no difference between the skill, care and the effort of the carpentry from the two different eras, there is still reason to think that hotels with good carpentry, they will survive more, or they will basically have disproportionately better carpentry than the ones that don't exist till date. Okay, so there I think D is the answer, that the better the quality of original carpentry in a building, there's less likely that building is to fall into disuse and be demolished. Does not really tell me anything about the skill of those people, right? Out of 8, or what a better number would be, let me just decrease this number so that the argument is more apt, right? Out of 5, I am saying 3 hotels exist from 1947. Ab 5 into 2 kar lo 10, to 3 into 2 6, and out of 6 I am saying 5 hotels continue to exist. So even though more hotels were built, but lesser hotels had good carpentry. Here less hotels were built, but more hotels, the ratio wise, more hotels had better carpentry. So here I cannot conclude about the skill of the people in the two eras by merely saying that there are only 3 hotels that continue to exist and here only 5 hotels continue to exist. Why? Because the better quality, the better the quality, the more likely a building is going to continue to exist, otherwise we'll demolish that building. तो अगर आपका number of hotels that continue to exist ज़्यादा है, that does not necessarily mean कि skill लोगों का better था. ठीक है, this was a slightly convoluted reasoning that I gave you guys, but hope you've understood this. I'll eliminate the options that you went ahead with. You went with C and B. Okay. B says hotels built since 1930 can generally accommodate more guests than those built after 1930. Those built before 1930. See, it is not clear whether it is not clear whether carpenters working on larger hotels would exercise more, less, or the same skill and care as those who are working on smaller hotels, right? So, therefore, this argument does not really weaken the argument. Uh, C says materials available to carpenters working before 1930 were not significantly different in quality from materials available after. See, argument does not even rely on difference in the quality of material. Argument relies on the skill of the people, right? So, therefore, it does not really tell me anything about the skill of the people at all. Okay, let's move on to the next question now. Okay, guys, you still here? I'm waiting for your answers so that we can start the discussion to this one. Confused? Okay. So let me explain this. Asim, you say B, and I agree B is the answer. Which of the following most strongly supports the argument against the challenge made above? What is the situation? The situation is that we have the pharma industry that is arguing that because new drugs will be not developed unless heavy development costs can be recouped in sales, the current 20 years of protection provided by patents should be extended, right? So they claim that so they argue for longer patents for new drugs to offset high R&D cost, राइट बिकॉज सालों साल लग जाते हैं आपको ऑप्टिमाइज लेवल पे मेडिसिन बनाने के लिए या वैक्सीनेशन बनाने के लिए एंड दैट इज अ ह्यूज कॉस्ट, राइट? सो दे आर सेइंग टू ऑफसेट द R&D कॉस्ट आई वांट टू हैव पेटेंट्स का टाइम पीरियड एक्सटेंडेड सो दैट आई कैन you know, so that I can claim profits for a longer period of time. क्योंकि जब तक आपके पास पेटेंट लॉक्ड है, तब तक आपका कोई कंपेटिटर आपका फॉर्मूला यूज करके सेम मेडिसिन नहीं बना सकता. Right, that is what it is. So critics argue that the patent extension, it is unnecessary, because other industries with high development costs, they also keep developing new products, right? So when you look at option B, which says clinical trials of new drugs which occur after the patent is granted and before the new drug can be marketed, often now take as long as 10 years to complete. So obviously, if you have to basically talk about it, if you have to talk about it, the pharma industry, it explains how it is different from other industries, because unlike other industries, it must wait for the clinical trials to get over to market those new products, to market those new drugs, to market those new medicines. So out of the 20 years that they have the patent, for 10 years to आपके trials में ही जा रहे हैं, right? So that is why you want that the patent period is extended, so that you can incur profits from the sales, right? And B is the best answer there. Well done, Asim. Let's look at another question. This is again a weakening question. Shruti says A. All right. So what is the situation? Let's quickly discuss the situation. We are talking about how, uh, yeah, we're talking about how a free wheel system of transportation, right? The airplane, it is as fast as a fixed linear system, which is a high speed train. So they're comparing an aeroplane with a high speed train, right? And we are saying that transport system, it is as fast as a high speed train. Now, because people prefer free wheel systems that do not have fixed routes, the high speed train, it will never find a sufficient market, right? So aeroplane is a free wheeled, and high speed train is a linear system, right? So you have to weaken the argument. Now the passage, it is basically arguing that consumers will choose to fly rather than use the high speed train, right? The argument is basically based upon a consumer preference for free wheel system. So aeroplane is a free wheel system, high speed train is a linear system. Now the definition of a free wheel system is one that does not really have any fixed routes, right? You can fly anywhere, right? The argument is weakened by any challenge to the definition of flying as a free wheel transportation system. So it is true that aeroplanes may be able to go almost anywhere, but commercial airlines, right? For example, if you travel by Indigo, you travel by Vistara, you travel by Air India, you travel by any airline, they fix the route, right? Commercial airlines, they establish fixed routes and they necessarily ensure that you travel to and from the airports. So you know you cannot really fly from anywhere to any place. There is a fixed route. You go to an airport, you take a flight to Mumbai, you land at Mumbai airport, then you go somewhere else, right? So even a free wheel system has a fixed route in that regard. So if airports are less conveniently further, if airports are less conveniently located for consumers than train terminals, consumers might prefer the more convenient of the two fixed route alternatives. So yes, Asim, the correction of your answer, C is the answer, that planes are not a free wheel system because they can fly only between airports, which are less convenient for consumers than the high speed train stations would be. So C is the answer. अब A में क्या है कि cars, buses, planes require the effort of drivers and pilots to guide them, whereas the train will be guided mechanically. See, the method of guidance is irrelevant to the argument about free wheel versus linear system. Exactly. So A is not the answer in that regard. ठीक है. Last question of the day. So this is a flaw finding question. I agree. E is the correct answer. Average weight gain is not the same as average weight. Yes, definitely. That an infant's low weight at 3 months is being compared with the national average, right? It shows that the child's weight gain has not been average. Now, how is the reasoning flawed? The reasoning is flawed because you're talking about a direct connection between average weight and the weight gain, right? So infant's weight is known to be below average for a 3 month old. No conclusion can be drawn about the weight gain, right? Weight is not the same as weight gain. So yes, E is the biggest flaw in that regard. So with this, we come to the end of our critical reasoning series for now, right? We come to the end of our critical reasoning series for now. Tomorrow, as discussed, we'll begin with FIJ. Allow me to tell you a little bit about the current batches that we are running. These are the batches that are being run on the platform. You can look them up. If you find them viable, do try to take a free class from these educators to see whether you'd 12 o'clock, हाँ, special class है, but it is not on YouTube. It is on the platform, Shruti. You're most welcome, Asim. Thank you guys for tuning in. See you guys tomorrow.